The flight that changed everything. The early morning hustle at Horizon Airlines was in full swing. The scent of coffee filled the air, mixing with the distant hum of announcements echoing through the terminal. Passengers hurried toward their gates, rolling luggage clattering against the polished floors. For Amanda Hayes, today was just another shift as a first-class flight attendant. The uniform she wore, a crisp navy blue blazer and a matching skirt, felt as much a part of her identity as the routine she had mastered over the years. She had been in the industry for nearly a decade, and if there was one thing she prided herself on, it was control. She knew the kind of passengers that frequented first class: business executives, VIPs, and frequent flyers who carried themselves with effortless entitlement. Amanda had a knack for reading people, making split-second judgments the moment they stepped onto the plane. But she rarely questioned those judgments. After all, experience had sharpened her instincts. As she reviewed the passenger manifest, she noticed a black family booked in first class. Something about it made her pause. Her gaze shifted toward Gate 12A, where passengers were beginning to line up for boarding. Then she spotted them. A tall, well-dressed man in a tailored charcoal suit walked confidently, his wife in an elegant emerald green dress beside him. Their young daughter, around 7 or 8 years old, clutched a small plush toy while skipping between them. Amanda's lips pressed together. They don't look like first-class regulars. She quickly dismissed the thought and returned to scanning her manifest. Their names were clearly listed under first class. No mistakes. Still, something didn't sit right. The Williams family. Darius and Naomi Williams had traveled more times than they could count, but today's flight wasn't just another trip. Darius, a respected entrepreneur, and Naomi, a financial strategist, had built their empire from the ground up. Their daughter, Zara, had grown up in the world of private jets and exclusive lounges. First-class travel was nothing new to them. But today, they weren't flying for luxury or leisure. They were evaluating the service quality of Horizon Airlines, the very company they partially owned as investors. Over the years, they had observed that despite their ownership, some employees treated them differently. This flight would serve as an unannounced test to see how the airline handled all passengers, not just those who fit the mold of first-class travelers. Darius adjusted the cuff of his suit as they approached the gate. "Ready for takeoff?" he asked, flashing a smile at Naomi. She smirked, knowing exactly what he meant. Zora looked up. "Mommy, do I get extra cookies in first class?" Naomi laughed, brushing Zora's curly hair gently. "You know the drill, sweetheart. Let's see how good their cookies are today." With that, the Williams family walked toward the gate, their confidence unshaken, unaware that someone was already making assumptions about them. Boarding the flight, Amanda stood at the entrance of the luxurious Horizon Airlines first-class cabin, welcoming passengers with her signature smile, polite, professional, and a little forced. When the Williams family stepped forward, she hesitated for a fraction of a second before regaining her composure. "Welcome aboard," she said, her voice carefully neutral. Darius handed over their first-class tickets without a second thought. Amanda took them, scanning them twice, before finally nodding. "Row 2, she said, handing them back and gesturing toward the plush leather seats. Naomi felt the pause, the slight hesitation, the extra second Amanda took to process their presence. She had seen this before, but today she simply smiled and led Zora forward. Darius placed their carry-ons in the overhead compartment, while Naomi settled their daughter into her seat. Zara, completely oblivious to the tension, was already flipping through her coloring book, swinging her legs excitedly. Amanda watched from a distance, her neutral expression hiding her thoughts. She moved through the aisle, greeting other passengers with her usual warmth, but something kept pulling her gaze back to the Williams family. Something about them made her uneasy. The first signs of tension. Once all passengers were settled, the plane taxied to the runway. Amanda stood at the front, demonstrating safety protocols, her voice smooth and rehearsed. As she spoke, Her eyes drifted to row 2 more than once. Naomi, ever observant, leaned toward Darius. "She's watching us," she whispered. Darius glanced up from his phone, noticing Amanda's gaze linger on them before quickly looking away. "Not the first time," he murmured, adjusting his watch. "Let's see how this plays out." Soon, the flight took off, and the first-class service began. Amanda moved through the aisle with a tray, taking drink orders. When she reached row 1, she beamed at an older couple, taking their order with warmth. When she reached the Williams family, her demeanor shifted slightly. "What can I get you?" she asked, her tone less warm than before. "Coffee, black," Darius said smoothly. "I'll have tea," Naomi added. "Can I have apple juice?" Zara chimed in, looking up with a bright smile. Amanda hesitated, just for a second, before nodding. "I'll check if we have apple juice." She left without confirming their order the way she had for other passengers. Naomi caught the small detail. Darius exhaled slowly. "Subtle," he murmured. A few minutes later, Amanda returned, handing out the drinks. When she reached Zora, she paused, holding the apple juice in front of the little girl. "Be careful with this. We don't want any spills, do we?" Zora's smile faded just a little as she took the juice. Naomi met Amanda's gaze directly, her expression unreadable but pointed. Amanda quickly moved on. In the background, another first-class passenger, a man in his 40s, noticed the interaction and frowned slightly. A quiet but tense flight. The flight continued in uncomfortable silence. Amanda found herself hyper-aware of the Williams family. Every time she walked past row 2, her eyes lingered, as if expecting them to do something wrong. Naomi saw it, Darius saw it, and so did the other passengers. Eventually, Darius pressed the call button. Amanda arrived swiftly, forcing her polite tone. "Yes. Can we get a blanket for Zora?" Darius asked, nodding toward his daughter, who had curled up in her seat. Amanda hesitated. "I'll check, but we might not have extras." Naomi raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. When Amanda returned with the blanket, she handed it to them without a word. Darius took it, offering a calm but pointed "thank you." Amanda nodded stiffly and left. This time, as she walked away, she noticed the whispers from other passengers. A woman leaned toward her husband, whispering, "She's treating them differently." Amanda's face burned. And for the first time that flight, doubt crept into her mind. The rising tension in the sky, the hum of the airplane engines, filled the cabin as the Horizon Airlines flight settled into its cruising altitude. The golden glow of the cabin lights reflected off the polished surfaces of the first-class seats, creating an illusion of comfort and exclusivity. For Amanda Hayes, however, that illusion was starting to crack. She couldn't ignore the whispers anymore. Passengers had begun exchanging glances. Some stole side-eyes at her, their expressions shifting between curiosity and disapproval. A few even had their phones out, subtly recording or typing something, though Amanda wasn't sure if it was about her. That unsettling doubt from earlier. It was now a storm brewing in her mind, but she pushed it aside. She was a professional, and she knew how to run a first-class cabin. Did she? Shaking off the intrusive thought, she glanced back at row 2, where the Williams family sat in composed silence. They weren't acting out of place. They weren't causing trouble. So why did she still feel uneasy? Her fingers tightened around the silver tray as she walked back toward the galley. She needed reassurance. Conversations in the galley. In the dimly lit galley, Amanda found Jessica Hart, the younger flight attendant who had been watching her with concern since the flight began. Amanda leaned against the counter, exhaling sharply. "Jess, can I ask you something?" Jessica turned, setting down a cup of coffee she had been preparing for a passenger. "What's up?" Amanda hesitated, then spoke carefully. "The Williams family," she said, keeping her voice low. "Do you think they belong in first class?" Jessica's expression darkened instantly. "Amanda," she said slowly, What the hell is that supposed to mean? Amanda straightened, caught off guard by the sharpness in Jessica's tone. I just mean, they don't seem like our usual passengers. Jessica crossed her arms. You mean they're not white? Amanda flushed. No, that's not. Then what exactly do you mean? Jessica challenged. Because all I've seen is a polite family who booked first-class fare and square. They're sitting there quietly. They're not bothering anyone. But you. Jessica leaned in slightly. You've been watching them like a hawk since the second they boarded. Amanda opened her mouth, then closed it again. Jessica shook her head. You don't even realize what you're doing, do you? Before Amanda could respond, a voice came through the cabin speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, we will be encountering some mild turbulence. Please remain seated and ensure your seatbelts are fastened. Jessica grabbed a nearby storage latch and steadied herself. Amanda, still flushed, simply nodded and walked out of the galley. An uncomfortable interaction. The turbulence was mild at first. A few dips and shakes, but nothing alarming. Amanda took a deep breath, pushing the conversation with Jessica to the back of her mind. She needed to regain her focus. She resumed her routine, checking in on the passengers in first class. As she approached row 2, she stopped at the Williams family. Everything all right here? She asked, her tone clipped. Naomi looked up, her expression unreadable. We're fine. Thank you. Amanda lingered. If you need anything, we'll let you know. Darius interrupted, his voice smooth but firm. Amanda's lips pressed together. All right then. She moved away, but as she walked back, she felt eyes on her. Other passengers had noticed her hesitation. One man, sitting across from the Williams family, leaned forward slightly, his brows furrowed in observation. A woman seated 2 rows back whispered something to her husband. Amanda clenched her jaw. Were they all watching her now, judging her? She swallowed down her frustration and marched back to the galley. A decision that crosses the line. The turbulence had settled, and the flight had resumed its normal rhythm. But Amanda, she couldn't shake the feeling of unease. She knew what she had to do. She walked toward the head flight attendant station where Mark Pearson, the senior in charge of the flight, was checking reports. Amanda cleared her throat. Mark, she said, keeping her voice low. I need to talk to you about something. Mark, a seasoned airline professional with a sharp eye for detail, barely looked up. What's going on? It's about the Williams family in first class. That got his attention. He put down his clipboard. What about them? Amanda hesitated, then leaned in. I think there might be a problem with their tickets. Mark frowned. What kind of problem? I don't know, Amanda admitted. I think we should double-check their boarding passes. Something feels off. Mark's eyes narrowed. You mean the family sitting there quietly, minding their own business? Amanda's stomach tightened. I just want to be sure, she insisted. Mark exhaled slowly. Amanda, tell me the real reason you're questioning them. Amanda hesitated. She knew she couldn't say it outright. Instead, she folded her arms and stuck to her story. I just want to follow protocol. Mark stared at her, and for a long, uncomfortable moment, he said nothing. Then, his voice dropped to a whisper. You're making a mistake. Amanda's face burned. So you won't check. Mark exhaled, rubbing his temples. Fine. But if this backfires? It won't. Amanda cut in quickly. She turned on her heel and walked back toward the first-class cabin, determination hardening in her chest. She wasn't wrong. She was just doing her job. Wasn't she? The moment that changed everything. Amanda stopped beside row 2. Darius glanced up from his tablet. Naomi set her magazine down slowly. Zara, still cuddling her plush toy, blinked sleepily at the flight attendant standing over them. Excuse me, Amanda said, trying to keep her voice professional. We need to verify your boarding passes again. Naomi's brows raised slightly. Darius's jaw tensed just a little. There was a beat of silence. Then Darius, ever composed, reached into his blazer pocket and pulled out the tickets. "Of course," he said, handing them over with a calm, knowing look. Amanda took them and scanned them quickly. Nothing was wrong. They were legitimate first-class passengers. Her stomach twisted. She hesitated, then handed the tickets back, her grip a little too tight. "Everything appears to be in order," she mumbled. "Of course it does," Naomi said softly. Amanda turned away quickly, face burning, her pulse hammering in her ears. She didn't dare look at the other passengers. Because now, she was sure, they were watching. They had seen everything. A flight towards consequences. The air inside the first-class cabin felt heavier than before. Passengers had noticed what just happened. Some exchanged uneasy glances. Others whispered to their seatmates. A few even picked up their phones, as if recording or taking notes. Amanda felt it all. The heat crawling up her neck. The tightness in her chest. She had just singled out a family who had done nothing wrong. And now she could feel the weight of that decision pressing down on her. But instead of backing down, Amanda doubled down. She had done what she thought was right. She was following protocol. Wasn't she? Or had she just made a terrible mistake? The shift in atmosphere. Darius Williams adjusted his cufflinks. His face remained composed, but Naomi could see the tightness in his jaw. She placed a gentle hand on his arm, a silent reminder. "Stay calm." Zara, their daughter, watched the flight attendant walk away, then turned to her mother. "Mommy," she whispered, "did we do something bad?" Naomi's chest tightened. She hated that question. She had heard it before, too many times. She forced a smile. "Of course not, sweetheart." Zara nodded, but her little brow furrowed in confusion. Darius sighed, tilting his head slightly toward his wife. "She really just did that," he murmured. "She did," Naomi replied, her voice low but firm. Naomi had spent years dealing with subtle discrimination, but this wasn't subtle anymore. Amanda had publicly called their legitimacy into question. And the worst part, she didn't even realize what she had done. But Naomi and Darius did, and so did the other passengers. Passengers began to take notice. Across the aisle, a middle-aged businessman with silver hair leaned toward his seatmate, shaking his head. "What the hell was that?" he muttered. His seatmate, a woman in her early 50s, sighed, tapping her nails against her glass of wine. "She's been weird with them the entire flight," she murmured. "I don't like it." A young woman a few rows back discreetly recorded the interaction on her phone, biting her lip as she watched Amanda retreat toward the galley. Passengers weren't blind. They had seen how Amanda greeted the white first-class passengers with warm smiles and effortless charm, but treated the Williams family with an icy distance. And now she had publicly questioned their right to be here. The tension hung in the air like a storm cloud. Amanda could feel it. But she still convinced herself that she had done nothing wrong. A talk with the senior flight attendant. In the flight attendant station, Amanda rubbed her temples. Jessica, her coworker, stood across from her, arms crossed tightly. "I can't believe you just did that," Jessica said, her voice low but sharp. Amanda exhaled sharply. "I don't get why everyone is making a big deal out of this." Jessica's eyes narrowed. "Amanda, you just pulled a black family aside, in front of everyone, and asked them to prove they belong here, when their tickets were already checked. Twice." Amanda stiffened. That's exactly what you did," Jessica snapped. Amanda's stomach churned. "I was just being cautious." Jessica scoffed. "No, you were being biased." Amanda bristled. "Are you calling me racist?" Jessica stared at her for a long moment. Then her voice softened, but it cut deeper than before. "I'm saying you let your assumptions guide you. And now, everyone on this plane sees you differently." Amanda's throat went dry. "Mark," the senior flight attendant, walked in then. His expression was unreadable, but his tone was firm. "Amanda, a word." Amanda followed him to a quieter section of the galley. Mark turned to her, rubbing his forehead. "I just got a message from the cabin crew. Passengers are complaining about how you handled that situation." Amanda's heart pounded. "They're saying you singled out a black family, that you embarrassed them in front of everyone." Amanda's breath hitched. "I was just following protocol." Mark held up a hand. "Stop. Just stop." For the first time, his voice held something else, not just authority. Disappointment. Amanda felt her stomach sink. "Let me ask you something," Mark said, his voice dead serious. "Would you have asked a white family to recheck their tickets after they'd already boarded?" Amanda froze. Her mouth opened. No words came out. Mark nodded slowly, watching her carefully. "I thought so," he murmured. Amanda swallowed hard, her face flushed with heat. I didn't mean." "Intent doesn't change impact," Mark said firmly. Amanda looked away, suddenly unable to hold his sharp gaze. "I need you to stay in the galley for the rest of the flight," Mark finally said. "I'll handle first class from here." Amanda's stomach dropped. "What? You're pulling me?" Mark's expression didn't change. "Consider it a warning. You're already in hot water. Don't make it worse." Amanda wanted to argue. She wanted to say that it wasn't fair. But deep down, a small part of her knew. She had crossed a line. And now, she was paying for it. Darius and Naomi's decision. Back in row 2, Naomi and Darius exchanged a glance. Darius leaned slightly toward his wife, his voice low and firm. "She really tried it," he murmured. Naomi sighed, but her expression was sharp as glass. "She did." Zara, still half asleep, nestled into Naomi's side, her little fingers gripping her plush toy. Naomi smoothed her daughter's hair, her heart aching at the thought of Zara growing up to face moments like this. Darius adjusted his watch, his mind already working. "We're filing a formal report," he said. Naomi nodded. "More than that." Darius looked at her. "She embarrassed us publicly," Naomi murmured. "She treated us differently, publicly." Her gaze hardened. "So, we'll handle this publicly." Darius exhaled slowly. He knew that look in her eyes. This wasn't just about them anymore. This was about something bigger. This was about accountability. Darius pulled out his phone, quietly composing an email. Naomi opened her messages, sending a note to their legal team. The wheels were already turning. Amanda Hayes had no idea who she had just tried to undermine. But soon, she was about to find out. The reckoning at 30,000 feet. The turbulence had settled, but the atmosphere inside the first-class cabin remained unsteady. Amanda Hayes sat in the galley, staring blankly at the metal counter in front of her. The dull hum of the airplane's engines vibrated beneath her fingertips as she gripped the edge of the counter, her mind spinning. Mark had pulled her from first-class service. Passengers were whispering about her. Jessica was furious with her. And the Williams family. They were too quiet. Amanda had made a critical mistake, and she could feel it unraveling beneath her feet. She had always believed herself to be professional, fair. So why did she feel like a villain right now? Her fingers trembled as she reached for a glass of water. She needed to calm down. She just needed to get through the rest of this flight. But what Amanda didn't know was that the real consequences hadn't even begun yet. Passengers take a stand. Meanwhile, back in first class, passengers were still talking. "Did you see the way she asked for their tickets again?" One woman whispered. "That was disgusting." Another man muttered. "I can't believe she thought she'd get away with that." The older businessman from earlier, Mr. Langford, sat forward in his seat, his jaw clenched as he checked his phone, his fingers hovering over the airline's customer complaint portal. Then, with a determined exhale, he began to type. "Complaint against Horizon Airlines flight attendant. Immediate review requested." Darius and Naomi set their plan in motion. Naomi Williams scanned her emails as her husband, Darius, typed on his phone beside her. "Zara, Their daughter was still asleep, curled up in her mother's arms. Naomi's lips pressed together as she stared at her inbox. "I've already sent the first message to corporate," she murmured. Darius nodded, tapping his phone screen. "And I just reached out to our legal team. They're waiting for us to land." His voice was calm, controlled, but Naomi could see the anger simmering beneath it. "She thought she could embarrass us," Naomi said, shaking her head. Darius exhaled slowly. She had no idea who she was messing with. Naomi met his gaze, her brown eyes steely. "She's about to find out." The email that changed everything. Back at Horizon Airlines corporate headquarters, an urgent email alert lit up the screen of Maria Castillo, the airline's chief operations officer. She clicked on it, her eyes widening as she read the subject line. Urgent, First Class Discrimination Report. Immediate investigation required. Maria's heartbeat quickened as she read the detailed complaint submitted by Naomi Williams. It wasn't just any complaint. It was an internal complaint from a high-level investor, one of Horizon Airlines' majority stakeholders. Her fingers flew over her keyboard, forwarding the email to the CEO with one urgent message. "We have a serious problem. The tension on board reaches a boiling point." Back on the plane, Amanda had tried to avoid the first-class cabin. She had kept her head down, washing dishes, wiping down counters, and counting the minutes until landing. But it didn't matter. She could still hear the whispers. She could feel the eyes on her. Her chest tightened as she noticed that Jessica had barely spoken to her since Mark's warning. And then, ding! The sound of the passenger call button rang from row 2. Amanda's stomach clenched. For a second, she hoped Mark would answer it. But when she peeked around the corner, she saw that Mark was busy with another passenger. Jessica was in economy. That meant it was her responsibility. Amanda inhaled deeply, straightened her shoulders, and forced her expression neutral as she walked back into first class. All eyes turned toward her. Her skin prickled with the weight of their silent judgment. She stopped beside Darius Williams, who sat with his fingers loosely intertwined, his expression unreadable. Naomi sat beside him, her gaze sharp. Amanda swallowed. "How can I assist you?" Darius studied her for a moment before speaking. "We need to speak to the captain," he said, his voice smooth but unshakable. Amanda blinked. "I'm sorry, sir." Darius tilted his head slightly. "You heard me. We'd like to speak to the captain." Amanda's pulse quickened. She had never had a passenger request the captain before. And something told her, this wasn't going to be a simple conversation. The captain gets involved. Amanda hesitated for a moment too long. Then Mark appeared at her side, his expression tense. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his eyes flicking between Amanda and Darius. Darius met Mark's gaze evenly. "We need to speak to the captain." Mark straightened, glancing at Naomi before exhaling slowly. "Give me a moment," he said, then turned toward the cockpit. Amanda fidgeted beside him, but Mark ignored her. Within minutes, the cockpit door opened, and Captain Ross Shepard stepped out. The veteran pilot's calm, commanding presence immediately changed the energy in the cabin. Darius and Naomi stood. Amanda felt her breath hitch. The passengers grew silent, watching intently. "Captain," Darius greeted, extending a hand. Captain Shepard shook it firmly. "Mr. Williams, what can I do for you?" Darius didn't smile. "My wife and I would like to formally report a serious incident of discrimination that occurred on this flight." A heavy silence fell over the cabin. Amanda felt her knees weaken. The captain's brows lifted slightly, but he nodded. "I see," he said. "Would you prefer to discuss this in private?" "No." Naomi spoke, her voice steady. "We'd like to discuss it here, publicly, just like we were humiliated publicly." Amanda's vision blurred. Passengers leaned forward, their expressions expectant. Darius crossed his arms. "I'd like to know, Captain, does your airline have a policy of singling out black passengers in first class, Or is that just the personal preference of your staff? A collective gasp rippled through the cabin. Amanda felt the blood drain from her face. Captain Shepard's expression darkened. That is absolutely not our policy. Darius gave a sharp nod. Then you need to start holding your staff accountable, Naomi said coolly. Because what happened here tonight was unacceptable. Passengers murmured in agreement. Mr. Langford, the businessman, spoke up from across the aisle. She's right. We all saw it. The young woman recording on her phone nodded grimly. Amanda could barely breathe. Captain Shepard's jaw tightened as he looked at Amanda. Amanda, in the galley. Now. Her legs shook as she followed him. She could hear the whispers as she walked away. She could hear Jessica's sharp intake of breath as she realized what was happening. And Amanda knew. Her career was over. The public fallout at 30,000 feet. The first-class cabin was now silent, but not the comfortable kind of silence that came with luxury air travel. No, this was the kind of silence that thickened the air, pressing down on everyone like an invisible force. Amanda Hayes could feel it in her bones. As she followed Captain Ross Shepard toward the galley, she caught glimpses of passengers staring at her, some with shock, others with disapproval, and some with quiet fury. Her entire body burned with humiliation. She wanted to disappear, but she couldn't, because she had done this to herself. A private confrontation in the galley. When they reached the galley, Captain Shepard turned on his heel to face Amanda. His expression was unreadable, but the weight behind his eyes was crushing. Jessica stood a few feet away, arms crossed, watching closely. Mark leaned against the counter, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced with something much colder. Captain Shepard exhaled sharply. Do you have any idea what you've just done? Amanda swallowed hard. Sir, No, he cut her off, his voice dangerously calm. Do not talk. Just listen. Amanda's mouth snapped shut. Captain Shepard's jaw clenched. I just had to hear, in front of first-class passengers, that one of my flight attendants was accused of racially discriminating against a black family. Amanda flinched. Do you have any idea how serious that is? He continued. You didn't just embarrass that family, Amanda. You embarrassed this airline. You put our entire crew in a position where we're now part of an official complaint. Amanda felt her throat tighten. I didn't mean. I don't care what you meant. Captain Shepard snapped, his voice hard as steel. Amanda jumped at the sudden change in tone. His chest rose and fell heavily, his temper barely contained. Then, after a long, heavy breath, he spoke again. This is not a debate. This is not about how you feel. This is about the fact that your unconscious bias led you to publicly humiliate paying passengers. Amanda's head spun. I was just trying to follow protocol. Protocol. Mark finally spoke, his voice like ice. He pushed off the counter and took a step toward her. Tell me, Amanda, if that family was white, would you have questioned their tickets twice? Amanda felt her breath hitch. Her silence was answer enough. Mark shook his head. You don't even realize what you did, do you? Amanda's entire body was trembling now. Captain Shepard exhaled sharply. I'm removing you from duty for the remainder of this flight. Amanda's heart dropped. Sir, please. Enough. His voice was final. Mark stepped forward. You'll stay in the back of the plane. You are not to interact with passengers anymore. Do you understand? Tears burned in Amanda's eyes. She nodded. She had lost. Completely. And she knew, without a doubt, that her career would never be the same again. The Williams family delivers the final blow. Back in first class, Darius and Naomi Williams sat calmly, watching as Captain Shepard returned to the front of the cabin. The murmurs among the passengers died down. Captain Shepard cleared his throat and addressed everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, I would like to personally apologize for the incident that occurred earlier. Horizon Airlines has a strict policy of equitable service for all passengers. We take this matter very seriously, And I assure you, steps are being taken. A few passengers nodded in approval. Others still looked angry. Naomi, ever the strategist, leaned slightly toward the captain. "Captain," she said smoothly, "I appreciate the apology, but you should know." She smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was a warning. This situation isn't over. Darius leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms. Not even close. Captain Shepard's shoulders tensed. But before he could respond, Naomi picked up her phone and tapped the screen twice. Less than a minute later, Mark received a message on his airline communicator. His eyes widened. "Captain," he said carefully, holding up the device, "you're going to want to see this." Captain Shepard took the communicator, reading the message on the screen. The color drained from his face. Passengers leaned forward, curious. Darius and Naomi just waited. Finally, Captain Shepard looked up at them. "You're—" Darius nodded. "Yes." Naomi's smile widened. "We're majority investors in Horizon Airlines." The entire cabin gasped. Amanda, who had been standing in the galley, overheard the conversation and felt her knees go weak. Captain Shepard cleared his throat. "I had no idea." Naomi held up a hand, silencing him. "That's the point," she said coolly. "We don't announce ourselves. We don't wave our ownership around, because we want to see how our airline treats people when they think no one is watching." She leaned forward slightly. "And now, Captain, we've seen enough." Darius tapped his phone screen. "We've already contacted corporate. Expect an immediate review of your in-flight staff policies." Captain Shepard nodded stiffly. "Yes, sir." And as for the flight attendant, Naomi glanced toward the galley, where Amanda stood, pale and shaking. Darius raised an eyebrow. "I trust you know what needs to happen next." Captain Shepard swallowed hard. "I do." The breaking point. Amanda couldn't breathe. Her vision blurred. She had humiliated the wrong passengers. She had ruined herself. And now she was about to lose everything. She felt it coming. And when Captain Shepard turned toward her, his face unreadable, she knew. This was the beginning of the end. The reckoning lands before the plane does. The tension in first class had settled into something even heavier than before. Passengers weren't just watching anymore. They were waiting. Waiting to see what Horizon Airlines was going to do about this. Waiting to see how Amanda Hayes would be held accountable for what she had just done. Waiting for justice. And at the center of it all, the Williams family, sitting in calm, poised silence, because they already knew what was coming next. And so did Amanda. Her career was over. She just didn't know how bad it was going to get yet. Captain Shepard issues his decision. Captain Ross Shepard turned away from Darius and Naomi Williams, exhaling deeply. He knew his next words were going to change everything, not just for Amanda, but for the airline itself. He turned toward Mark, the senior flight attendant. "Mark," he said, his voice low but sharp, "escort Amanda to the crew station and remove her from all passenger duties immediately." Mark nodded once, then turned toward Amanda, who was standing frozen in shock near the galley. Amanda's throat tightened. "Sir," she started, her voice trembling. Captain Shepard held up a hand, cutting her off. "You are officially relieved of duty, pending an immediate internal investigation." Amanda's stomach dropped. I didn't." "This conversation is over," Captain Shepard said, his tone final. Passengers murmured in approval. Some even clapped softly. Amanda's face burned with humiliation. She felt Jessica's stare from across the galley. Jessica, the one flight attendant who had tried to warn her. Jessica, the one person on this flight who had called her out before it was too late. Jessica, who was now watching her downfall unfold in real time. Amanda's legs felt weak as Mark gestured for her to follow him. This wasn't supposed to happen like this. She was supposed to be in control. But now she was nothing more than a disgraced employee being walked away in front of the entire first-class cabin. She was just another name in Horizon Airlines' disciplinary files. She had been reduced to a cautionary tale. And the worst part, it wasn't over yet. Naomi's next move. As Amanda disappeared into the galley, Naomi leaned toward Darius. "Check your inbox," she murmured. Darius pulled out his phone, refreshed his emails, and smirked. "They're fast," he murmured back. Naomi smiled slightly. The Horizon Airlines corporate board had already received their formal complaint. Not just about Amanda, but about the entire airline's handling of first-class treatment for black passengers. And they weren't just asking for an apology. They were asking for a full review of staff training. They were demanding mandatory bias education for all employees. And if the board didn't comply, Naomi and Darius would pull their investment from Horizon Airlines. A decision that would send shockwaves through the aviation industry. A decision that would cost Horizon Airlines millions. Darius locked his phone screen and set it on his tray table. Naomi sipped her water. And together, they waited for impact. Amanda faces the aftermath. Amanda sat alone in the back of the plane, her hands clenched into fists. Her career was crumbling before her eyes. Passengers were whispering about her. She was being escorted off-duty like a criminal. But worst of all, she couldn't convince herself that she was the victim anymore. Because deep down, she knew the truth. She had been wrong. She had let her bias lead her. And now she was going to pay for it. Mark stood nearby, keeping an eye on her like she was a liability. Jessica, still working in economy, hadn't even looked at her since everything went down. And when Amanda finally dared to glance up, she saw that another flight attendant was quietly filming her, recording the moment she had gone from being a respected crew member to a cautionary tale. The humiliation was unbearable. She squeezed her eyes shut, wishing the plane would just land already. But deep down she knew this wasn't the end of her downfall. It was only the beginning. The Williams family wins before they land. With less than 45 minutes left in the flight, a corporate alert was sent out to all Horizon Airlines executives. It read, "Emergency or ESPONSE required. NVE store COMPLANTESHALAGON." Inside Horizon Airlines corporate headquarters, an emergency boardroom meeting was called. The CEO, the PR team, and the legal department were all pulled in. Screens flashed with passenger reports. Social media had already picked up whispers of the incident. Posts like, "Did anyone else just witness that racist flight attendant on Horizon Airlines? Disgusting. First-class bias is real. Horizon Airlines is about to get a lawsuit. I'm on this flight right now, and let me tell you, Amanda Hayes just ended her entire career." And then, the final corporate bombshell dropped. A message from Naomi Williams, directly to the CEO. It read, "We will be taking immediate action following this flight. Expect a formal meeting request within 24 hours. At the bottom of the email was the CC list. It included the FAA, Federal Aviation Administration, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, major aviation watchdog groups, multiple high-profile journalists. The CEO's stomach dropped. Horizon Airlines was in deep trouble, and they knew it. The final approach. As the plane descended, Darius leaned toward Naomi and whispered, "Ready for landing." Naomi smirked, adjusting her watch. "Oh, he landed already," she murmured. "She just hasn't felt the impact yet." Amanda sat stiffly in the back of the plane, staring blankly ahead as she waited for the moment when the doors would open. And she would have to face the consequences waiting for her outside. Passengers began gathering their belongings. Phones buzzed with notifications. The whispers were getting louder. And the moment the plane touched the runway, Amanda knew her world would never be the same again. The landing that shook the airline. The plane touched down at JFK International Airport with a soft jolt, the wheels screeching lightly against the tarmac. The moment Horizon Airlines Flight 729 hit the ground, Amanda Hayes' fate was sealed. She felt it in the way passengers sat forward in their seats, eager to disembark and tell their stories. She felt it in the icy silence of her colleagues, who had already distanced themselves from her. She felt it in the way Jessica wouldn't even look at her disappointment louder than any words. Amanda sat in the crew station, staring blankly ahead. She was no longer a flight attendant. She was a walking scandal. And the moment that airplane door opened, she knew her reckoning would begin. The walk of shame. The fasten seatbelt sign dinged off, and immediately, passengers stood up, stretching, gathering their belongings. Amanda sat frozen. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. Then she heard it. A sharp, deliberate voice from the first-class cabin. "We'd like to disembark first." Naomi Williams. Amanda's stomach twisted. Captain Shepard, now standing near the cockpit door, nodded immediately. Of course, Mrs. Williams. A flight attendant near the exit quickly cleared the aisle, motioning for other passengers to wait. And then, Darius, Naomi, and their daughter Zara rose from their seats, gathering their things with calm precision. Naomi adjusted her designer handbag. Darius smoothed his blazer. Zara, still sleepy, held her stuffed animal tightly. They weren't in a rush. They had already won. As they walked toward the exit, they passed Amanda's station. Amanda kept her head down. She didn't want to look at them. But Naomi stopped, right in front of her. Amanda felt her presence before she even looked up. Slowly, Amanda lifted her gaze. Naomi's expression was unreadable, but her eyes carried a message. Amanda opened her mouth. She wanted to say something. Apologize. Defend herself. Something. But before she could, Naomi spoke first. "I hope you learned something from this." That was it. She didn't yell. She didn't insult her. She just let those 7 words sit heavy in the air. Then, with a final glance, she turned and walked off the plane, her husband and daughter beside her. Passengers watched in silence. The moment the Williams family stepped out of the aircraft, the whispers began again. "That was powerful," a woman murmured. "She didn't even have to raise her voice," another passenger whispered. And then someone did the unexpected. A slow, deliberate clap echoed through the first-class cabin. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, half of first class was applauding the Williams family as they left the plane. Amanda felt her throat tighten. That applause. It wasn't for her. It was a goodbye to her career. Corporate damage control begins. Inside Horizon Airlines corporate headquarters, chaos had already erupted. Executives had been called in early, emails were flying across departments, and a full-scale crisis response team had been deployed. The CEO, Daniel Crawford, stood in the boardroom, reviewing the Williams family's formal complaint. His hands clenched into fists. "This is a nightmare," he muttered. Maria Castillo, the COO, exhaled sharply. "Sir, it's worse than that. Their legal team has already sent a preliminary review request. The FAA was already aware. The NAACP was already involved. Social media was exploding. And the Williams family. They were majority investors in the airline. This wasn't just a PR disaster. It was a financial catastrophe. Options, Crawford demanded. What are our options?" Maria took a breath. "There's no avoiding this," she said. "We need to issue an official apology immediately." Crawford's jaw tightened, and the flight attendant. Maria didn't even hesitate. "She's done." The termination. As Amanda stepped off the plane, she was immediately pulled aside by Horizon Airlines HR representatives waiting at the gate. She expected it. She just hoped it wouldn't be public. But nothing was going in her favor anymore. "We need to speak with you in a private room," one of them said. Amanda nodded weakly, following them. When she entered the small HR office inside the airport, she was met with a folder of documents and the exhausted face of her union representative. "We've received multiple complaints about your behavior on Flight 729, the HR director said. In addition to a formal discrimination report filed by our investors, Amanda's stomach churned. HR flipped through the folder. We've also received passenger complaints, multiple eyewitness statements, and the incident has already gone viral online. Amanda felt lightheaded. Her career, her entire future, was slipping through her fingers. We are terminating your employment with Horizon Airlines, effective immediately. Her vision blurred. No suspension, no probation, just termination. She opened her mouth to plead, to say something, anything. But the HR director didn't care. There will be no further discussion. A security guard stood near the door, waiting. Amanda clenched her fists. This was really happening. She had been stripped of everything. And the worst part, she had done it to herself. The Williams family's final move. Back in the VIP lounge, Darius and Naomi sat with their legal team. Their lawyers were already reviewing settlement terms. Corporate is scrambling. One lawyer smirked. They're begging to meet with you. Naomi exhaled. Good, because we're not done yet. Darius leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. They think firing one flight attendant is enough, he mused. Naomi shook her head. They think this is just about one flight, she murmured. They don't realize this is about all the flights, all the black passengers who have been treated like second-class citizens in first class. Her lawyer nodded. Then we move forward. Naomi sipped her coffee and smiled, because they weren't seeking revenge. They were demanding real change. And Horizon Airlines, they had no choice but to listen. The aftermath. The next morning, headlines exploded. Horizon Airlines faces investor-led discrimination investigation. Viral video exposes first-class bias. Major airline under fire. Black investors force airline to overhaul training after shocking flight incident. And in small, hidden corners of social media, Amanda's name had already been leaked. Her face was everywhere. She had been officially blacklisted from the airline industry. And the Williams family's fight had only just begun. Final note: the victory that changed the industry. 1 month later, Horizon Airlines announced new industry-wide diversity training. Bias training was made mandatory for all staff. A new passenger advocacy program was launched. And Naomi Williams. She was appointed to the board to oversee the changes herself. The airline tried to silence them. Instead, they helped rewrite the rules of the sky.